in Regina from Wesley. Great. Welcome, June. And as others are arriving, please let us know who you are and where you're from. And as people are doing that, I typed a note at the very beginning of the chat box there, but I'll just repeat it as more and more people are arriving, that you should be able to see and hear Brad and myself. However, as participants in the webinar, your microphone and video is not enabled, so you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you, which is why we'll use this handy dandy chat box to be in conversation with one another. So that's a space where you can let us know who you are, where you're joining from, and we'll have conversation there throughout. And that's where you can pose any questions that you have throughout the webinar, and I'll be keeping track of those and making sure we get to all the questions, or as many as possible. And if you have any issues with the volume or with your camera, there are buttons to be able to adjust the volume. So you can just monitor that on your own computer, and some connections are a little different, so you'll need to find a volume that is appropriate. We have more and more people introducing themselves. So we have Paula from Cedar, BC, and Sam Stevens from Parksville. And Susan Butler Jones from Gatineau. If you folks who have just introduced yourselves could also let us know, are you in paid accountable leadership, lay leadership, what what is the context that you're bringing to this discussion? That would be fabulous. And as others are arriving, if you could let us know as well who you are, where you're from.
I'd offer to sing, but it's just the two of us, Lauren. Hey, Nancy. Kanawaki United Church. I'll say a few words now so that people can test whether or not they can hear me. Those were my few words. Good. Thank you, Lauren. And today's presentation will last just under 60 minutes, and I've already let Lauren know that she'll keep track of time, and if there is time between segments, there will be an opportunity for your questions to be posed and answered. You'll see the agenda on the screen. We're going to take 15 minutes to introduce the core concept of this congregational development tool, the idea of Already Missional. And although it says sample interview there, we won't have time for that, but you'll get to see what the interview questions are and ponder them for yourself. 30 minutes to look at the 9 questions that drive the consultation process for the model, and hopefully there'll be time left over for ample question and answers. So I'll jump right in and start us on the first slide. The assessment questions for this model are on the screen. The readiness questions represent the following areas: looking at strategy and focus, ministry and support, partnerships and people and property and finance, and in the center you'll see Already Missional, which is also a readiness category. Now the assessment questions behind each of these areas were developed over a 5-year period, and the iterations were tested by students in my congregational development course at Huron College in London. And the congregations that students represent over the years are Anglican, United Church, Presbyterian, Christian Reformed, Baptist, Disciples of Christ, and some non-denominational community congregations. So before we look at the readiness questions, I want to discuss the core concept behind the model, and that's the idea that congregations, through their parishioners, are already missional.
How this is resonating with you
congregations are already missional, but for the most part they don't know it. They don't know it because they can't recognize it, and this congregational development model attempts to make that visible. Congregations are gifted with mission-minded parishioners who too often are overlooked. These mission-minded folk provide leadership to the community's various social sector organizations, and they do that apart from any connection with or mandate from their congregations. And too often clergy and parishioners don't connect this community service with congregational mission. Rather than assuming that mission begins only in the church, a missional congregation needs to recognize that God is already on mission in the community before the local congregation does anything. Now, missional leaders don't assume that parishioners are missional blank slates. Missional leaders recognize that parishioners may already be engaged in personal or community activities that parallel congregationally sponsored ministries or align with the realm of God that we're called to envision. So think of yourself for a moment, or think of other parishioners in your congregation. How many are serving as board members, or volunteers, or financially support agencies and organizations in the community? Here's an important question. Is this activity recognized as part of your Christian calling? Is it recognized by your congregation as part of the parishioners' Christian calling? The Already Missional model coaches congregational leaders to value the community service that parishioners are engaged in as a contribution to the congregation's larger missional strategy. Already Mission thinking understands that mission strategy includes partnering with parishioners who have community partnerships. An important concept in community development is to see our relationships and our partnerships as individuals as important assets for the organization to which we belong and for the community. So parishioners in mainline congregations typically are active in community service outside the congregations. Quite often it's folk in our congregations who have established a number of the social sector agencies in the community. Parishioners in our congregations serve as volunteers in leadership positions in the community and not-for-profit organizations. And while many parishioners may be motivated parishioners may be motivated to serve in the community by their faith, most have learned that public expression of faith isn't always recognized, especially in a secular culture. And not only do they find that expressing their faith in the community, in the secular community, is discouraged, they realize that their work in the community isn't recognized by their congregations. So what that leads to is parishioners concluding that their community service doesn't count as Christian service. Again, even though it may be motivated by faith, and most often because parishioners don't know how to confidently talk about their faith in conjunction with their community service, there is that disconnect that arises. So the already missional model and this idea of already missional recognizes the connection between community service and congregational mission. Now, I've been talking a lot about community service, but the same thing applies for family service. For some people, their particular mission is lived out with their children. And if you ask what it is that they are giving themselves to in service, they'll think of their children. And congregations probably do a better job of recognizing that we can incorporate the mission of raising our children into congregational life. But even then, there's often this disconnect. It isn't stated explicitly, and therefore there's some loss of connection there. So, Lauren, let me pause there and invite any questions or comments that people have about this central idea before we get into the readiness questions. And just two ideas to summarize this while people might be raising their questions. Parishioners in mainline congregations are typically active in community service outside the congregation. I've got some American data on that, and especially data that shows that people may be motivated for community service because of their faith, but they're reluctant to name that in their community service. And too often clergy and parishioners don't connect this community service with congregational mission. Yeah, and if I understand correctly, if people are registered, they can revisit this webinar again and again.
The connection between serving in the community and one's faith makes a difference in terms of missional ministries in the wider community.
So let me move forward then with, here are a set of questions that you can ask a person in the congregation that will help us to get at the person's already mission. And while I read these, I invite you to think about what are your answers to these questions. What's so important that you're willing to sacrifice your time, your talents, your treasures significantly for it? What are you willing to? One way of putting this is, what are you willing to die for? But for some people, the sacrifices that they make, especially, for example, parenting, it's more of a slow death. Sacrifice day in and day out, losing sleep. If you can find out what someone is already making a sacrifice towards, you get a sense of what they're passionate about and where they see their mission. Another question, where do you serve others beyond church-sponsored activities? For example, parenting in the neighborhood, the community, the workplace, and the world. Now, an interesting note, when I asked this question of the MDiv students at Huron College, it's a difficult one for them to answer, because as people in training for paid accountable ministry, they've already figured out how to align their energy and their talents with church-sponsored mission activities. And in fact, they've had to, in many cases, uncouple from the ministry and mission that they're already doing so that they can free up resources to serve the mission of a particular congregation. So they don't know what to do with this question until they interview people in their congregation and they get to hear people talking about activities they're involved in, and most often activities that they're not aware of as a pastoral leader. Next question is, how does this service relate or connect to your faith? And this is a question that helps to measure if there is a connection. And the common answer given by people to this question in especially mainline congregations is something like, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. I'm doing this so that I can serve others. And because they're quoting that golden commandment, there is a recognition, or at least an opening in a conversation to help them recognize that this is somehow motivated by their faith. And the last question is often the most discouraging one in terms of answers. How has your congregation sustained you in this service, if at all? And oftentimes the answers that get recorded from the interviews the students do with parishioners have it revealed that either it hasn't occurred to the parishioner that their congregation can be a resource for supporting them in their mission, or they've made some attempts and there's that disconnect. No, I leave it wide open for the parishioner to decide. The parishioner gets to name whatever they do, and whether or not when this got published in Missiology International Review, the first round of feedback from the reviewers was, well, what if a parishioner's mission has nothing to do with the church or any of the goals of the church? And so what I had to reinforce in my article was that doesn't matter. The point is that the parishioner is on mission somewhere, and covenanting is about bringing those two things alongside one another. Abram, Sarai were already on a journey, already on a mission, when God came up and said, let's offer a covenant. The work of ministry is figuring out how to nurture that partnership between whatever mission the person is involved in and what the mission of the church writ large is. In the later part of the presentation, when we look at community partnerships, the primary point will be this. Rather than focusing on a partnership between my governance structure here at Grace United Church and the governance structure of some social sector organization out in the community, rather than focusing on a partnership at that governance level, the partnership that we have at Grace United Church with any number of organizations is the person who's in the congregation, who is involved in that world. So remind me of the question again, because I need to link this back to that. Okay, so it makes the first difference really within the congregation. The congregation is able to expand its sense of mission. In the community, when there's an awareness within the congregation that people in the congregation stand as the partnership with social sector organizations, then resources and support can be directed both to the person in the congregation and through the person in the congregation to that organization. Okay, so the next part of the presentation goes back to these 9 readiness areas that need to be developed in a congregation to be, already missional. And before I jump into the readiness questions, I want to look briefly at one of the models that's guiding the selection of the readiness questions. If you want to note at the top of the slide, there's a yellow bar, and it has the words data, vision, ability, motivation, resources, action plan, and evaluation, all leading to results. I want to talk a bit about this model and it'll help to understand how each of the areas of readiness contributes to getting results. So this model or matrix is called getting results, and I've heard it called by other names like the IBM model, but I've never been able to source it. But nonetheless, I like it, and I use it with MDiv students, and I find that it shapes how I approach project planning. And so very quickly, what the matrix explains is you need to have these 7 elements in order to get results in project planning. And when any of the elements is missing, you're likely to end up with a certain unwanted outcome. So for example, without proper data to guide a project, you're really working ideologically rather than in an evidence-based approach. And churches are famous for doing that. Someone says, I got a great idea, but you have no clue whether or not that idea is justified by what's out there in the setting. If there's no guiding vision, then there's going to be an element of confusion that occurs with the project. If the people doing the project aren't able to do it, that is, they don't have the specific skill, if you don't teach the child how to tie the shoe, then they're going to feel anxiety about the task of tying their shoes. If, when it comes to motivation, if there isn't an internal, an intrinsic motivation, if there can't be a connection between the project and a person's motivation, what they're already motivated to do, your project will probably end in apathy. If you have everyone in place, but there are no resources available to do it, then you end up with frustration, which is, I guess, the United Church of Canada right now. If you have all of that, but there's no clear action plan, then there's going to be false starts. And what we know in churches is because resources are limited, any false start may very well tank the entire idea. And finally, if after you do everything there's no evaluation, then you're working on an assumption that things actually worked. So I go through that quickly so you can hopefully see the value of attending to each of these factors. And the 9 readiness areas and questions relate to each of the various getting results matrix. And you'll see along the way in the slides that I've circled the ones that apply. So, and going now to readiness question 1, one more pause that I want to make, and that is I want to you to notice the red, yellow, and green light. Ideally, if I had a traffic red, amber, green icon there, that would be great. Each question includes a color-coded set of 3 possible responses to the question, the readiness question that's posed in that section. So individually, and then as a group or communally, you consider the questions and responses that best describe your congregation. The red response suggests a lack of readiness in the area. The yellow response suggests the need for innovations that will lead to readiness. And the green response suggests missional readiness in this area and good to go in that direction. And this is really important, and I'll keep repeating this throughout the presentation. The goal isn't so much to have all participants agree on a color or an answer. Rather, the goal is to generate conversation and a general framework for action. So let's go to readiness question number 1. When was the last time your whole congregation participated in a visioning or a mission strategy conversation? Visioning for mission can be a big conversation that gathers a congregation with a formal process to create a formal mission strategy, or missional visioning can be many small, informal conversations that respond to emerging community needs. guided by an informal mission strategy. Some experts argue that strategic planning is wasted energy in a world of discontinuous change. And so I say the mission strategy isn't as important as the missional conversations that keep visioning evergreen. So the first readiness question measures two indicators related to missional conversations: frequency of those conversations and the level of participation. Is it everyone or just a small select group who gets to decide what we're going to talk about? Did the visioning conversation engage the entire congregation? Was it recent? And if it's been 3 years before you've done something, make that a benchmark for needing some further action. So I want you to note that the readiness question here relates to the vision factor in that bar in the getting results model. So again, a couple things to keep in mind. Keep this conversation going and the Spirit will speak. It's a handy phrase learned from someone here in the congregation. And mission strategy isn't as important as the missional conversations that keep visioning evergreen. Readiness question number 2. Missional focus. And this also relates to, on that upper bar, the vision factor in the getting results model. So here's the question. Is your congregation's missional strategy focused internally or externally? The second question measures two indicators excuse me, related to missional strategy: external focus and influence on governance and ministries. The missional movement has reminded us that an inwardly focused mission for a congregation leads to ecclesiocentrism. The church is the center of everything. And we know from experience that a vision or mission strategy that, that if it fails to connect with what the congregation actually does, then it's just going to sit on a shelf and collect dust. So the red light mission strategy, the red light answer would sound like this. Missional strategy, most of our energy goes into surviving. And unfortunately, that's the state of many congregations. Yellow, what? We have a mission strategy, but it doesn't influence all our ministry. And the green light answer is our missional strategy focuses all our ministry on the community and the world. And that's fairly ideal, but it at least points to something. So let me highlight again, the missional strategy doesn't need to be complicated, just intentional and focused into the world. And when congregations have regular missional conversations, a missional plan or strategy eventually emerges. A missional strategy doesn't need to be a formal strategic planning document. Some congregations relish a comprehensive document with clear targets and outcome measures, and some congregations simply need a sentence that fits on a t-shirt, but it's the focus that matters. And so, a couple things to remember. Yep. Yeah. Buy my book. That's the tip. That's why I made the resource and did it at the invitation of Rob Dalgleish, because there's a need for something simple to structure that conversation, something that's approachable and people can study, get everyone on the same page, and then either bring in an edge consultant or if you feel comfortable bringing in someone else or doing it yourself, working through these questions either in one larger event or taking each question one at a time over a long period. Neighborhood. Yeah, so when I talk about community, I'm talking about the congregation or mission unit within its neighborhood, within its larger community, and that can also mean what the community is doing internationally. Okay, and so I'm going to go to missional ministries now, readiness question number 3. And this is the readiness factor that needs the most explaining, so bear with me. But it needs the most explaining because it builds on the idea that the church has some core ministries, and that doing these core ministries is central to doing the mission that we're called to as a church. Now, this idea of core ministries was an idea developed by Maria Harris, the late Maria Harris, who was an American Roman Catholic who taught Christian education, youth ministry, and women's studies. She argued that the church has 5 core ministries and that they each need attention in the development of individual Christians. So Harris pointed to these 5: liturgia, kerygma, koinonia, diaconia, and didache. Now, before you get stressed out about the Greek words, nobody uses the Greek words. Instead, we have in our congregations a variety of English and French words, and I just have the English ones here, that correlate with these terms. We have things like worship ministry, proclamation or evangelism ministries. Over the United Church, so we don't have those. Fellowship or pastoral care ministries, service or outreach ministries, and education or formation. And so you can see how they correspond with these core ministry areas. These are often the names of committees in a congregation, or in the United Church tradition, these ministries are overseen by the session or by the elders. Now, Harris pointed to Acts chapter 2 for a snapshot of these 5 core ministries. And I want to make it clear that she doesn't fall into the trap of suggesting that the early church is the blueprint for how the church should be organized. Rather, she points out that these 5 core ministries, which have endured through 2,000 years of the church, have their expression here in Acts chapter 2. And this is just a convenient scripture passage for showing where they're described and where they're described first. So we see in Acts chapter 2 that the first description of the church includes also, in addition to these 5 core ministries, an emerging organizational dynamic that's concerned with being of one accord and sharing things in common or being in community. And so this reminds us also of the organizational dynamics that relate to vision and mission strategy. I won't linger on this slide too long because I know you all have it memorized because it's scripture. Going back then to missional readiness question 3, measures if these 5 core ministries exist in some intentional kind of way. So the question, does a work group, that could be a committee or a network, exist to oversee each of these core ministries? If that ministry is existing, and let me back up for a bit. It doesn't have to be a committee. It can be some kind of network. But the point is, if there isn't some formal structure that's looking at this ministry, then likely it may not be happening, or it's only happening accidental. And so if it's missing, that's a great place to start. And this is often where I've seen congregations start when we've tried it through the MDiv program. And what I want you to notice too is that this relates to the ability and motivation piece. Now, I want you to indulge me, and if those of you who have seen this presentation before will have heard me say this, and I apologize that I don't have a larger blow-up of the red hand that's to the left, but this is a corny way to help at least my students remember these 5 core ministries. If you take your left hand, and that hand can illustrate ministry, I guess you don't have to do it, but if you can imagine it. hand representing hands and feet taking action, or if you want, the flames of Pentecost in the story. Each finger is a reminder of the 5 core ministries. So if you lift up your thumb, there you go. Thumb is a reminder of worship because it's a thumbs up to God. Like I said, this is corny. Don't get too wrapped up about this. A didache, or a teaching ministry, pointing out people what they need to learn, which is a really bad way of understanding Christian education, but it helps remember it. I won't hold up my middle finger, but some people define diaconia as its etymology is referring to kicking up dust in haste when serving. And Maria Harris picks up on this in her book, and she talks about the ministry of troublemaking. And so that middle finger is a reminder that there's some ministry to be done there, kicking up dust in the community by serving the social order. Koinonia, or fellowship, think of your ring finger, and that represents relationship. And kerygma, or proclamation, your pinky finger, which is about promises and our promise to share the promise or the good news of God. Corny, but there it is in all its glory. So I use these 5 core ministries to help students also do quick assessment of the endless amount of congregational development resources out there, so that without having to read an entire book before you buy it, you can look through the index and see whether or not they're addressing all 5 of these core areas, or if they're leaning towards one or the other. And again, there's no one way to enact any of these ministries, and that's how the model is designed. Not about telling people how to do it, but telling people at least try and do it and work within your context. Readiness question number 4, and let me pause here for a moment. Just let me get a sense of the time, Lauren. We're 20 minutes out, so we have, what, maybe 10 minutes left in this section? Okay, we'll see if we can reach that goal. Missional support. The 4th readiness question relates to organizational ability and motivation. And the question is, do your governance and support committees have a stake in the mission strategy, and do they consult with your core ministry committees to provide solutions to ministry needs? So in United Church structures, support ministries fall under the oversight of Committee of Stewards, or the trustees, or the M&P committee, the property committee, the finance committee. If these support committees, and I don't need to convince anyone of this, if these support committees are disconnected from the missional conversation and strategy, then they start to conflict with the core ministries. So the 4th readiness question measures 2 indicators related to missional support: missional integration and level of consultation. Red light is governance and support ministries work independently from the mission strategy and core ministries, and this one unfortunately is quite common. Yellow is depends on the support committee and core ministry, or maybe the personalities on that committee. And green is, regularly by all governance and support committees. In a missional congregation, governance and support processes serve the needs of core ministries, not the other way around. Support ministries serve core ministries, not the other way around. But when you look at a number of congregations, it's the tail that's often wagging the dog. In a healthy, so we all have our stories of a property committee, for example, vetoing youth ministry initiative because it's going to leave marks on the floor. In a healthy congregation, support committees are part of the missional conversation, so they have to buy in to the overall mission.
As we've gone through,
so again, a couple things to remember. In a missional congregation, governance and support processes serve the needs of core ministries, not the other way around.
Would you like to know more?
And if not, they'll eventually be at odds with core ministry initiatives.
I know I've been sitting here thinking of
So I found that, sorry, let me go back. I found that this question draws a polarity of responses, which is good. And again, a reminder that we don't need the participants to agree on whether it's red, green, red, yellow, or green. In fact, there's going to be disagreement depending on each parishioner's perspective. That's not where change occurs, not by agreement. It occurs from the conversation that generates data, which then informs decision-making. So the fifth readiness question, which comes up here, seeks to balance that. This is about missional people. Now, this is one of the more difficult factors to boil down to just one question. People are at the core of missional ministries, and as a congregation,
what would that look like? Kind of
their maturity has a lot to do with the success of the congregation. So the question asks, how readily does your congregation adapt to changes in the culture? Red answer, we don't see any need to adapt. The world should change to fit us.
So Nancy
we're open to change, but struggle to adapt. That's the amber one. Or the green light is we're able to adapt while preserving core values. And again, like the last one, there's going to be lots of disagreement here, but the conversation it generates is important. So missional congregations require adaptable people. And adaptability is an important capacity for cross-cultural relationships, and that's important, especially in the missional church literature. Being cross-cultural means that you're able to bridge the gap between the culture of your congregation and the culture of the community, rather than an ecclesiocentric approach, which suggests that the church waits for the people in the community to figure out our culture and to bridge the gap towards us. And adaptability also relates to identity. In systems theory, the homeostasis of a system attempts to maintain living, to survive. And adaptability allows that system to move from one steady state to another, and that's when identity is formed, when you can identify that something exists over time through all of those changes. Identity is driven by adaptability, and that's why having adaptable people is important in a congregation that's on mission. Question 6, and I'm going to do this one and skip over the next few of them because I think we're running out of time. Missional partnerships. The question is, what's your congregation's reputation in the community? A congregation that's externally focused will have a positive reputation in the community, more times than not. And that reputation creates opportunities for partnerships in the community through people and even between organizations. Reputation is like trust, earned over time and lost in a moment. A congregation's reputation in a community is a measure of its efforts to be the good news of Jesus Christ to the community. A solid community reputation can be lost in those moments when churches take discriminatory or self-righteous uneducated public stance. It can be lost in a moment. It takes a long time to nurture. But just as damaging is when a congregation's community reputation is lost slowly over decades for lack of community relationship. Having no reputation can be just as debilitating as having a negative reputation. When a congregation is forgotten by the community, it may be because the community was forgotten by the congregation. Reputation is relationship, and relationship is reputation. So the red, yellow, green answers here to guide the conversation are: red, outside of members, closing our congregation would have minimal impact on the surrounding community or neighborhood. Yellow is, we used to have an impact on the community, and we want to engage the community again. I think that's where most of us fall. And under green, we are a recognized partner in our community's well-being. We have that reputation. If you're familiar with asset mapping, you'll know that people and partnerships, I said this earlier, are considered assets. Partnerships are not only formal congregationally approved agreements, but more importantly, like I said before, partnerships include the relationship that individual parishioners have already with outside groups. So, two things to remember. Congregation's reputation in a community is a measure of its efforts to be the good news, and reputation is relationship, and relationship is reputation. I'm going to move very quickly over property and simply say that this model has some questions about how to look at property. A couple things just to share with you as ideas. People form strong attachments to property, and these strong attachments can be a source for missional energy. I'm not a big fan of the thinking that you must sell your buildings, and if you hold property, that's a bad thing. Hoarding property and
model, and
just giving it away without thinking through that decision in terms of mission is two sides of the same coin. And property is often central to animating each of these 5 core ministries. We need space as human beings. Under the financial question, what drives your congregational giving to your annual budget? Just going to say very quickly that let me just use a really bad analogy. Economists track economic activity within a country, that's the gross domestic product, plus the economic activity of citizens abroad, and that's the gross national product. Churches tend to obsess over the congregational GDP, that's givings to all internal expenses, but we ignore the congregational GNP, which is what our people are doing beyond just the local budget. We tend to think that our worship service is the economic engine that drives our income. But in this missional model, with the emphasis on partnerships, what drives a congregation's finances is the degree to which each individual feels that their already mission, their personal or their communal service, is supported by the congregation.
Well,
and so, rather than focusing energy and resources on only worship, how do you focus resources and energy on the people who are on mission? So, I'm dealing with that one quickly, but only because I want to just wrap up with the final question, which brings us full circle. And that's the already missional readiness question. Is your already mission valued as a contribution to your congregation's mission strategy? This is basically the 4th question in that opening set of interview questions posed differently.
Each and every one of you
finding out from people, and this will be all over the map, whether or not what they're already doing in the community is valued by the congregation, and whether or not they have a sense that there is a partnership and that they are the partnership.
A follow-up email.
So I'm gonna
to the recorded webinar.
Just pause it there and say that's a quick overview of the 9 readiness areas. I think we're at the 10 minutes to the end of the hour mark,
in addition,
and so maybe let some questions drive what we talk about next.
Get a copy of Brad's slides so that you can revisit those. So thank you so very much, and blessings everyone on your day, and please do check out the EDGE website, which has listing of our upcoming webinars. We have lots of great stuff planned.
Yeah, narrative budgeting is excellent because it gets you closer to talking about what people are actually doing. But again, if you look at most narrative budgets, there's simply a narration of the congregational's internal financial activity. So simply narrating it doesn't get to the outcome that I'm suggesting.